other day I got a call from a person who works at Channel 7, and she wanted to know what the title Staying Alive in the 80s was about. And I told her that I didn't know that, and referred her to Professor Howard Zinn. And so Howard is going to be on, there's a Channel 7 morning program hosted by Ted O'Brien, and it's going to be taped Thursday, and it might air Friday morning. I did want to announce that. Howard Zinn is professor of political science at Boston University. His latest book is The People's History of the United States. He is a most perceptive, caring, ethically sensitive, and courageous man. I'm very honored to present him, and the title of his address is Staying Alive in the 80s. Howard Zinn.
I'm always happy to come to the community church. I've never been happy about coming to churches in general, but this is a very special place. You see what I mean? They don't allow children to cry in all churches, or to yell or speak, or have children's programs right out there in front of adults so that adults can be educated the way children are. And there aren't many churches, maybe aren't any churches, where you can hear the story of Adam and Eve told as I heard it in some astonishment just a little while ago. I think we need a revised edition of the Bible, and with that story of Adam and Eve in it. So I'm very glad to be here and to talk about staying alive in the 80s, which is a title I thought up before I knew what it meant. That is, this, you know the secret of titles. Secret of titles is that people invite you to speak, and they say, what will you speak about? You think about something that you would like to hear somebody speak about. And so you give the title, and then you have the problem of figuring out what it means and what, therefore, you should say. So I thought about it. Although, frankly, whenever I'm at the community church, I always have this feeling that the people here know everything that I tell them, you see. And they're the most remarkably polite people in the world. They don't let on. They act as if, they're hearing something new, different. But I know that they secretly know everything I tell them. But they just want to hear it again. And I go on because I guess I want to hear it again myself. So, of course, there's an immediate and obvious meaning to this question of staying alive in the 80s. And that is survival, that we know. Yes, that is a problem, surviving. And we know especially that that's a problem because there seem to be people and forces around that are intent on our not surviving. And these people and forces are not within any one territorial boundary. they are indiscriminately dispersed around the world, but always in seats of power. And they're the ones we have to worry about in the matter of survival. And you can't tell who endangers your survival by their nationality, by whether they're Russians or Americans. You can tell mostly by how much power and authority they have. For instance, if you run into somebody named T.K. Jones, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, you know immediately by that title that he is not going to defend you. He may offend you. You will read that T.K. Jones, although I think I know people who have important posts in the government, I had never heard of T.K. Jones. And then I began to suspect that nobody had ever heard of T.K. Jones, that he was invented. But no, there he was, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense. And he was informing all of us how to survive in a nuclear age, because that is his specialty. He is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for, Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategic Nuclear Forces. And he advises us that if we want to survive nuclear war, it's not a big problem. Quote, dig a hole, cover it with a couple of doors, and then throw 3 feet of dirt on top. It's the dirt that does it. I found this encouraging. Then he was quoted in an interview with the Los Angeles Times when asked, I suppose, by a fearful reporter, perhaps the reporter made fearful by listening to his first quote, and trying to calm this reporter's concerns, he said, everybody's going to make it if there are enough shovels to go around. Well, when we hear people like this, we know that there is a problem of survival. And we know from whom we have to, about whom we have to worry, and whom we have to watch. All these people with titles like that, whatever country they are in. But not only people who sound a little off the wall, not only people who are as easily consigned to the booby hatch as T.K. Jones, but people who are respected and who are not dumb but smart, not stupid but bright, not easy to deride but heroes of our time, but still people in power. Because we mustn't let all of the things we hear from officials in the Reagan administration delude us about and prevent us from understanding that whatever administration we have had in power in the nuclear age, we have been in danger from those people in charge of the bombs. And you have to go to the brightest president, that is that man acknowledged to be the brightest president and the wittiest president and the best-looking president of the post-war period, John F. Kennedy, who said it in October 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, yes, in a nuclear war, even the fruits of victory would be but ashes in our mouth. He said, therefore, we do not seek a worldwide nuclear war. And then in the next sentence he said, but neither will we shrink from it. These leaders who will not shrink from nuclear war are those we have to worry about. So we know that we have a problem of survival. And we know that we cannot depend in the matter of survival on those people who are in power everywhere in the world. It's not that they deliberately want to kill everybody. It's that they don't care enough, that they have other concerns, they have other priorities. There are things that seem to mean more to them, and they have a history, these people who are leaders, they have a history of sacrificing huge numbers of people, tens of millions of people, for slogans and symbols and fetishes and mystical objects of worship, flags and words and notions, at the end of which the corpses lay strewn all around, and nobody could understand what good had been achieved in the world. So we know we can't depend on them. We know we have to depend on ourselves. And we have to think, I believe, beyond the matter of survival. Because to survive is to live beyond other people, to live when other people have succumbed, to be survivors when other people have gone. In a certain sense, we who are here today, we who still live, are survivors. Because in our time, even before nuclear war and without nuclear war, in our time, tens of millions of people have died for no good reason. Not a result of avalanches and earthquakes and blizzards and natural calamities over which people did not have control, but have died as a result of man-made catastrophes. And we have, yes, we have survived them. When I was I was thinking about this, I thought back to the people that I knew that I had survived. And I thought about two men who were with me when I was in the Air Force. And we were, all the three of us were very close. We'd gone through all our training together, and then we went off to different theaters of war. And two of us were bombardiers, and the third was a navigator, and we were in touch with one another and wrote to one another from different theaters of operations. And then the war was almost over. And 2 weeks before the war ended, I got a letter back which I had sent to Italy to one of these two friends, Joe, and the letter said deceased, 2 weeks before the war was over. And then when I came back home after the war, because I thought I would give this news if he didn't have it to our third friend from whom I had not heard for a while, I discovered that 1 week before the war ended, he was killed. So I of the three who had spent so much time together and played basketball together in the training camps and gone on 7-mile runs together and done all the things that people do when they're in basic training together, I of the three survived. And I never outlived completely, never outgrew, never overcame the fact of that survival. And I can understand how other people who have survived the deaths of others close to them have never been able to overcome that, or to stop thinking of that, or stop dreaming of it. And I knew that it was not enough to survive, while others, as we have seen, 50 million people dead in World War II. The two men that I knew personally represented the tiniest fraction of 400,000 Americans who died in that war, and an even tinier fraction of the tens of millions of others in other countries who died. And then there are all the other things that happened after that war to end all wars. 1 million dead in the war in Algeria, and several million dead in Indochina, and 500,000 dead in Indonesia, and 2 million dead in Korea, and so on. We know it's not enough to survive, that we owe something to these people who are gone while we survive. We owe to them creating a world in which those kind of man-made calamities don't take place anymore, in which no war takes place. However lofty, enticing, romantic the slogan, the excuse, the reason, that no ideological reason, no political reason, no boundary, no act by anybody in the world, however offensive, justifies the kind of indiscriminate killing that modern warfare represents. And so we must pronounce a curse on all war and determine to stop it, you see. But I knew as I was thinking about this problem of staying alive in the 80s that I meant that, and I meant something more than that there are people in the world who have survived, who are alive, but who live in ways that most Americans find it hard to imagine. People who live and do not live. When Khrushchev said about nuclear war, the living will envy the dead, there are situations other than nuclear war in which the living envy the dead, in which the people who live in such circumstances, live in the midst of such famine, pain, sickness, oppression, as to make them wonder often what the difference is between life and death. And we know that people who live in those circumstances, and there are such people all over the world, are people who must rebel in order to change their circumstances. And as we live in this world, we watch these rebellions. We see them take place. And we know that they must take place, that people must rebel. The change cannot take place without people rising up against these conditions. And these create very painful situations because these rebellions are very often violent and are met with violence. And they very often lead to consequences which nobody can foresee, and yet we know that that process of rebellion must go on if that living death, which most of the world has endured, changes someday into the kind of life that human beings deserve to live. And we have the special responsibility because we live in one of those superpowers in the world which intervenes when people rebel to put them down. And just as we would hope that the people of Russia would protest, and may one day protest when they can, when their government suppresses a rebellion somewhere, whether it's in Afghanistan or Poland, we have the responsibility of speaking to our government, protesting our government, putting ourselves in the way of our government when it intervenes in the rebellions that take place in Latin America and other parts of the world where people are wanting to change their lives. That is beyond survival. That is moving to the point of changing the way people live, of moving from oppression to freedom, or maybe moving through rebellion to another stage of life which requires another rebellion, because our experience so far with revolutions in the 20th century is that one revolution doesn't seem to be enough. The American Revolution wasn't enough. The Russian Revolution wasn't enough. We have to apparently get accustomed to the idea that revolution, rebellion, change is an ongoing thing. It may have to go. People may have to keep moving on and maintain their courage and maintain their resistance and move through the different layers of change until we break through these clouds to some new kind of world. There's another sense in which I meant staying alive in the 80s, and that is to really live, to do more than be passive observers of the changes going on in the world, or passive observers of the repression going on in the world, or passive observers of the move towards war that are going on. To be engaged, to be active, to be involved, to be alive in that sense. Because not to do that, not to be engaged, is to be a participant, an observer, a passive acceptor of the things that go on in the world that go against life. So we have to figure out ways in which we can maintain the energy, excitement of engagement, of struggle, of resistance, of disobedience, of organization. And this means several things, I think. It means making connections with other people. Because we know that we cannot do these things alone. We cannot stay alive alone and really be alive. We are most alive when we are doing things with other people, and we are joining with other people. We feel that there is some common ground, some common interest, some common motive that all of us have, which draws us to one another. And what we find when we move out of our isolation and look for other people who think the same way about the fundamental things in the world, about right and wrong, and about peace and war, and about freedom and oppression, we find a remarkable number of people who are there, everywhere. And this is very important. We cannot stay alive unless we know this. We cannot really be alive unless we are aware of how many people there are around us, very close to us, people we may not even have suspected think the same way, and people in our country and people in other countries who have the same motivations, the same desire to live, and the same desire to let other people live. And we've had the experience, we who are sitting here, we've had the experience in our time, not long ago, of seeing such movements of people develop and grow, and people get to know one another, movements which reach the point where they become national movements and have effects, real effects, on the policies that are being made. We've seen this in the women's movement and the black movement and the anti-war movement. And we've seen movements develop in other countries, surprising movements, where there weren't supposed to be any, where it didn't seem movements could develop. I mean, how could you have a movement that would develop against a dictatorship that threatened people with death, like Batista's in Cuba, or Somoza's in Nicaragua, or the Shah in Iran, or any of the other places in the world, or against the military regime in Poland. Who would have suspected that these movements would have arisen, and yet they did. And now we're seeing in this country, just very recently, I suppose maybe by people who read statements by T.K. Jones, or Vice President Bush, or Rostow, or any of these other characters wandering around, we are seeing very quickly a rise in movements against nuclear war. And if you don't put them together, if you don't keep a close eye, if you don't watch them, you begin to feel alone, and you begin to feel powerless. But if you put them together, then you see what they amount to. That in Western Massachusetts, when the issue was put on the ballot of more money for nuclear weapons or more money for social policies, people voted overwhelmingly against nuclear weapons. Here in Boston, when it was put on the ballot, in every precinct in Boston, people voted for take money away from nuclear weapons and use that money for social and economic needs for people who need it. Catholic bishops gathered in assembly, hundreds of them adopted a resolution overwhelmingly saying that nuclear war is unthinkable under any circumstances. There's no such thing as deciding, is this a just nuclear war or an unjust nuclear war? There's no such thing as a nuclear war which is just. This is a remarkable change for, we'd seen it among priests and nuns. We'd seen it among Catholic lay people, but we hadn't seen it among Catholic bishops and archbishops. And that's a good sign. We've seen the Catholic Church in Latin America and the role it has played in support of movements of rebellion. And all over this country, we've seen the rise of a movement against nuclear arms, of plebiscites and town meetings in Vermont and New Hampshire, and people giving up their jobs in war industries to devote their life to working against the nuclear arms race. And so a soldier in Germany, you remember recently Jim Bergeron joining a peace rally, and then of course being ushered out of the army. They don't want that word to spread. They don't want whole divisions attending peace rallies in Europe. Let's get him out. Put him in civilian clothes. But 900,000 young men not registering for the draft. Oh, maybe they're not 900,000 activists, but quiet non-registration. Unassuming, modest, anonymous non-registration of close to 1 million people is a very healthy sign. And we see all of this spreading very, very quickly. And the physicians for social responsibility, and the educators for social responsibility, and the nurses organizing, and the high-tech people around Route 128 organizing, and all of that happening here and in other parts of the country. You can stay alive better when you know about these people and these groups and how many others there are who, like us, do not want nuclear war to take place. One more thing to help to stay alive. I mean, alive in the positive sense, beyond the question of survival. And that is to understand, to think about the fact that all through history and down to the present time, the writers, the artists, the musicians, the singers, the poets, the playwrights, the people who have represented life beyond survival, who have represented the best and highest aspirations of human beings, those activities in which we are most human, in which we are doing more than mere living, but we're singing and painting and imagining and fantasizing and joining with other people in ecstatic activities. Those people, those poets and those philosophers and those writers and those musicians, all through history, have been against war, have been against oppression, have been against nationalism. Going way back, when the Greek political leaders, and some of them are exalted in our schools. Pericles' funeral oration is sometimes given to students to read as if it were a noble thing. And what he's doing is explaining why the Peloponnesian War is good, and why the people of Athens must fight for democracy and liberty and all those noble things against the tyranny of Sparta and so on. But in the Greece of that golden age, you also had the playwrights, and you had Euripides and Sophocles, who wrote about civil disobedience, and who wrote against war, and who represented that cry of artists against war. And in our time, in modern times, all you have to do is think about Tolstoy, who at a certain point, after he'd written his great novels, became more and more involved in the movement against violence in the world and the movements for the poor. And Zola, leaving his retirement to come out in defense of Dreyfus. And Picasso, and the poets and writers of Latin America, Pablo Neruda. And in this country at the turn of the century, the writers and artists who became socialists, who became supporters of the IWW, of the labor movement, of Giovanetti, who at the time of the Lawrence textile strike said to the mill owners, while the women and children were out on strike, he said, you will win if you stay out. They cannot weave cloth with bayonets. And Mark Twain and Theodore Dreiser and W.E.B. Du Bois and the black poets of the 1920s of County Cullen and people like Richard Wright in the 1930s. And think of Helen Keller, who declared her socialism in 1911 and 1912 and began to write about socialism in a new world. I think of all of these people, the best people of our time and the talented people of our time and the musicians and singers right up to the present day. I was thinking of that as I was listening to some of the music today, thinking how good it is to have the musicians on our side, and how just recently here in Boston we had several thousand people gather in Symphony Hall, and several hundred musicians and singers had volunteered their time and their beautiful talents to sing out and play out for a nuclear freeze against the idea of nuclear war. And we need that to stay alive. And we have that more and more. And it's very important to remember that. We have to have better memories than anybody else because we're besieged every day by the electronic signals that are trying to give us amnesia, that are trying to obliterate the sensory impressions we get from the artists and writers and musicians and the filmmakers. The more and more good documentary films that are made that show sort of the signs of a growing culture of understanding. They're trying to obliterate all of this from our minds with this constant barrage from radio and television to get in the way of that. And so we have to stay alert and keep our memories very, very fresh and pull all of these recognitions of what other people are doing together. And this is what I mean, I guess, by staying alive. That's how I hope to stay alive in the 80s. Not merely to survive, but to be aware of all these things and all these people and all these movements and to participate in them and to taste some of the artistry and to taste some of the signs of what a new world can be like. We have to do that. We have to listen to music and go out into the sunshine and give ourselves and other people little glimpses of what the world has to be like for people everywhere. And one of these generations, maybe ours even, you see, something remarkable will happen. Not out of the blue, not suddenly. It will happen as a result of the growth of movements which we are part of now, which we don't even recognize even while we're a part of it now, but which is happening all over the world. And these movements will grow and grow and grow to the point where remarkable and miraculous things will take place. They won't be miracles. They will be a result of people staying alive, insisting on staying alive, and staying alive together. Thank you.